Hi everyone. My name's Owen. Thanks Leslie for a very interesting talk. I want to start with a couple of references to the centenary of the First World War II. Two things specifically which are related to two of the main focuses of my organisation, ForcesWatch. First of all, the issue of child soldiers. Usually when we think of child soldiers, an image is evoked of something that happens elsewhere, perhaps somewhere in Southeast Asia, perhaps in Latin America, perhaps in Africa. 100 years ago, the UK had roughly 250,000 boy soldiers, so boys, some as young as 12, according to recent historical research, fighting. A third of sailors in the Navy are estimated to have been under 18. So 18 was the official age in which you could join the armed forces, and in theory you weren't supposed to be deployed to a war zone 100 years ago until you were 19. But 250,000, and as far as we know they were all boys, fought for the UK in the First World War. Today, the armed forces recruit. Does anyone know the minimum age of armed forces recruitment in the UK? So you can start the process when you're 15 and 10 months. 16 is the kind of official starting age. So in a sense, we've gone backwards on that. One distinction is that now, apart from in exceptional circumstances, you aren't to be deployed to a war zone in the UK Armed Forces until you're 18. But that's an interesting kind of parallel that I wanted to draw. Today, over 90% of the 2,460 minors, so children joining the armed forces, join the army. So overwhelmingly they're going to the army as opposed to the Navy or the Royal Air Force. 35% of those go to the infantry, so a significant proportion, and that's as opposed to 23% of adults now joining the armed forces. This is significant because the infantry is one of the most dangerous parts of the armed forces. The risks of being killed and being developing some very serious mental health problems, amongst other things, are significantly higher there compared to some parts of the armed forces, which is, it's a no-brainer. If you're an officer in the Navy, not in a war zone, as opposed to being on the front line in recent years in Afghanistan or Iraq. You were twice as likely to be killed in Afghanistan in the British Army if you joined at 16 as opposed to 18 or over. So there's a really significantly higher risk for the youngest recruits. And there are similar trends with mental health problems. And that is essentially because those joining at that age are overrepresented in those more dangerous parts of the armed forces. There is also a factor that you tend to stay in slightly longer, so it might involve additional deployments. But that's kind of something really significant that I wanted to draw out. However, this evening I'm going to focus on the military's influence in the education system in the UK. So I just wanted to mention that kind of issue as something that we work on a lot and something that certainly has relevance to today. But in terms of the education influence that the military has and had, 100 years ago during the First World War, there was a lot of recruitment in schools, very overt, including teachers openly saying, come on, think about joining to the boys. There were cadet style activities, so military style training, getting the children ready for potentially joining the armed forces. There were things that we don't have today, such as growing food on playing fields because agriculture was so disrupted. And one quite interesting parallel, there were lots of teachers who joined the armed forces to fight, and that caused a lot of disruption to education. Today we're having or seeing a visible increase in the encouragement of teachers to join the Army Reserve in particular. So be a part-time soldier as well as being a teacher, and schools can sign up to show their support for their reservists through sort of policies and allowing them extra leave and so on. So again, there's lots of parallels, and in some ways, if you see these as concerns, we haven't progressed very much. But I think it's useful to kind of think about what has changed. One significant thing is that 100 years ago, you left school typically at a very young age. It was only the very privileged that would carry on to late teens or early adulthood. Whereas today, very shortly, we're going to see the increase of compulsory education to 18. However, the armed forces are going to be able to be considered a provider of that. education. So it's not that you have to stay in school necessarily, you can go somewhere that is offering some sort of education. Reports have suggested quite strongly that the education being provided by the armed forces to the minors that are joining is very low standard. And remember, it's mostly the army that are doing this, mostly the army that are taking these minors on. Just very briefly, going back to the minors thing, because I think it has so much relevance to what I'm going to say about schools. 78% of the UK public are in favour of raising the minimum age of armed forces recruitment from 16 to 18. So if you agree with that, you're in the vast majority of public opinion. The UN and the UK Human Rights Committee, amongst other organisations, have urged the UK government to raise the age. There's currently a judicial review going on, which basically has picked up on the fact that if you join at 16, you end up having the 2 years till you're 18 and then 4 years after that, which is actually discriminatory, as opposed to those who join at 18 and just have 4 years. So that could be very interesting when that kind of goes through in July. However, for the remaining time, as I said, I'm going to focus on the influence of the military in schools, and specifically in schools in Scotland. After the cadets, so we're talking about the Army Cadet Force, Sea Cadets, the Air Cadets, and the Combined Cadet Force, which are the ones that are attached to schools, traditionally private schools, but I'll come to a slight change on that shortly. After the cadets, and after recruitment adverts by the armed forces, mostly on TV, online, in the cinemas, on the radio, also in public space, so posters, stalls and things like that, the armed forces engagement with education is its biggest way of interacting with young people. I'll come to some stats shortly, but the two things I want you, I think, more than anything, to take away from my talk this evening are that recruitment and what is referred to as providing positive information to influence future opinion formers are the two main reasons why the military, so the armed forces and the Ministry of Defence, do this youth engagement. So recruitment and giving positive information to influence future opinion formers. The other thing I want you to take away is that there's a great unevenness here. It's not neatly and kind of evenly laid out. Nothing is in this issue. All of the significant things, so the rates of risk of being killed, risk of mental health problems, chances of your school being visited, etc., it's all very uneven. Sometimes it's quite closely tied to economic disadvantage or privilege. Sometimes there's other factors, but it's really useful to kind of break it down and say, okay, it seems on the surface that it's quite even, but actually when you go in a bit deeper, you see that it's really not. I'm not going to cover the armed forces' influence in universities in Scotland or in the UK, but suffice to say very briefly that the stuff that happens in universities is very similar to what happens in schools. There's kind of parallels for everything. So where you have the Combined Cadet Force in schools, you have university service units. Where you have sixth form bursaries in schools, you have undergraduate bursaries, so you get paid part or all of your tuition fees. And where you have kind of the armed forces going into school careers events, you have them going to university careers events. The difference would be that at the university level it's officer focused, so they're looking to recruit officers, commissioned officers. At schools it tends to be focused on non-officer roles in the armed forces in terms of the recruitment. Interestingly, NUS Scotland recently passed a resolution through their executive to say they're going to encourage students' unions in Scottish universities to campaign against recruitment activities and kind of what they see as an unbalanced representation of the armed forces. So watch this space on that. That hopefully is going to be something interesting and as a development on this issue. Sixth form bursaries, just very briefly, as I cover sort of some of the different aspects. So it's £1,000 to £1,500 a year that you get from the Army, Navy or RAF. They vary a bit between the different armed forces. You are then committed to join the armed forces unless you pay back that money. Typically, the students would go on to university and get another bursary. In fact, the Army have recently changed it so that you automatically get put onto that unless you actively opt out. So very much focused on a long period of time in which you're receiving money from the armed forces. In return, you serve in the armed forces for a minimum of 3 years. A new development in England specifically, but it has some relevance to Scotland, is the Department for Education's so-called Military Ethos in Schools programme. And basically this was an initiative that's come under the coalition government, although Labour in the last government were interested in some aspects of it. And it's saying there are problems in schools. There's problems with attainment and there's problems with discipline, and we've got some solutions, and the solutions proposed are a mixture of combined cadet forces and expanding them big time into state schools in England, and specifically disadvantaged state schools. Troops to teachers, so getting veterans from the armed forces into teaching jobs, fast tracking them. Alternative provision with the military ethos, so for students that are at risk of becoming disengaged from education, taking them out of the classroom and putting them in military style alternative provision schemes, such as outdoor activities in military uniform. And that's one that's very present in Scotland. An organisation called Skillforce, which is one of the main providers of that, works in quite a lot of parts of Scotland. Those are the main aspects of the Military Ethos in Schools programme, and it's kind of different. It's not just coming from the Ministry of Defence, it's a collaboration with the Department for Education, and there's been lots of questioning of that from teachers' unions, amongst others. It's not by any means just people who would identify as a pacifist, anti-militarist, what have you, that have qualms about this. Why are these solutions being prioritised? Are they as effective as it's being suggested? What is the evidence that this is any better than any other approach, given the same amount of money? Interestingly, the last combined cadet force in a state school in Scotland disbanded in 2009 because it didn't have enough members and because there were concerns about where to store safely the rifles. Just a little anecdote there. Quickly onto one thing that, amongst many others, I've put on the table back there. Recently, the government launched a so-called learning resource called the British Armed Forces, and ForcesWatch, along with the Quakers in Britain, launched a critical response to it in March, which gladly actually got some national media attention. Basically, this was a Ministry of Defence and Prime Minister's Office collaboration, which the Department for Education then emailed to all schools in the country, literally every school, as far as we can tell, in the country, primary, secondary, private, state, every part of the UK. And it was basically presenting a very, very one-sided picture of the armed forces, past, present and future. It had recruitment angles in there. It looked at issues such as nuclear weapons and the British Empire without any acknowledgement that they might be slightly controversial. Very, very dodgy stuff, particularly given that we have an Education Act which states whenever a political, and I acknowledge it's a kind of divisive term, a political point of view is put across, students have to encounter an opposing view. They have to get the sense that it's controversial, it's a debate, it's not one-sided. So, I do encourage you to take a copy of that report at the end. It's free, although donations are welcome. So obviously that applied to Scotland as well. But coming to Scotland very specifically now, the main part of the school's engagement that the military do is visits to schools, though sometimes schools also go to military bases. In terms of overall figures, the armed forces make around 11,000 visits to UK schools each year. And significantly, that has gone up from around 1,000 in 2008, so there's a massive leap in recent years. It's around 900,000 pupils each year that are encountering the armed forces in this way, which, if you break it down, is about 15% of the 8 to 18 cohort. So quite a significant proportion of students meeting the armed forces through one of these visits each year. We've only got an incomplete picture, I have to be upfront about that. So the report that I've got copies of on the back, which focuses on Scotland, has data from 2010 to 2012. We wanted to do it to 2013, but the Army significantly couldn't provide reliable data. They acknowledged that quite openly for the 2012-2013 year, although there is more research upcoming, and I'll mention that very shortly. Another example of inconsistencies. Through Freedom of Information requests, we found that, or we were told that there were 835 visits in 2011 to 2012 to schools in Scotland, whereas the parliamentary question that gives that overall figure of 11,000 visits said that there were 1,211 visits. So quite a significant difference, and it's hard to know which data is more reliable, which could well be considered a concern in itself. Who's keeping track of these visits? What's happening with them? Also, the term visit is a bit ambiguous. It can actually mean, well, it actually means going to the school on one day, which could then involve multiple activities with multiple year groups. So it could, basically this is a minimum picture that we're getting here. Strikingly, 1,211 visits, according to the parliamentary question, were made to schools in Scotland. Scotland represents about 8.4% of the UK population, but that proportion of visits is about 11.2%. So significantly higher than what it should be, which is interesting. And that unevenness, again, is coming in. It's the same for Wales, it's the same for Northern Ireland. The report that we published was backed by the Educational Institute of Scotland, which is Scotland's largest teaching union. They, in 2007, committed to calling for members to oppose recruitment by the armed forces at schools, which was a significant move. NUT, the National Union of Teachers, did something similar the year after. So there have been significant moves by teachers' unions and others to question this stuff. And one of our roles, I think, is to encourage them to kind of act on that. So that was really good. Very briefly, because I've got just 2 minutes left, the report showed that there were 83% of state secondary schools in Scotland were visited at least once in that 2-year period. So the vast majority of state schools in Scotland were visited by the armed forces at least once. The Army made 42% of the visits, so they made significantly more than the Navy or the RAF. Although, again, when you break it down, in some areas the Army are dominant, in others they're not, and vice versa for the other two. So it really does vary between the different areas. In comparison to state secondary schools, only 50% of private schools in Scotland were visited, and they weren't visited at all by the Army, so only the Navy and RAF visited private schools. Another example of the unevenness. Further education and sixth form colleges tend to be visited more frequently. So over the 2-year period, 27 were visited on average 9 times over that 2-year period, and 3 of those were visited more than 20 times. State secondary schools, we had 31 visited more than 10 times in that period, and 6 were visited over 20 times. In terms of what the visits actually entail, there's certainly a kind of explicit recruitment angle to quite a lot of them. So 36% of all the visits in that 2-year period were careers events, and the Navy did the most of those, the Army slightly less, but still a significant proportion. Some were curriculum related, although, as you've heard, with that Armed Forces learning resource, that's not necessarily something that's reassuring. And the rest were what's known as personal development, but the Army did say in their kind of response to the FOI question, this would typically end with a kind of discussion of the jobs that are on offer. So recruitment is kind of embedded in all of those activities, even if they're not explicitly recruitment activities. Interestingly, the Ministry of Defence and Armed Forces more recently have been saying that they don't go into schools to recruit, despite many of their documents being very clear that they do recruitment. And what they're doing here is very suspiciously narrowing the definition of recruitment to mean literally signing kids up then and there, which in the most cases would be impossible anyway, because if you're under 18, which most students would be, you have to have a parent or guardian sign your papers. So it's very sort of telling that they're so keen to deny that when essentially it's quite clear it's happening. Recruitment is a process, that's our stance. It happens through many ways, giving a positive impression of the armed forces in school, not looking thoroughly, and we've got this on anecdotal evidence from people who used to go into schools, that they're not looking thoroughly at the risks, the downsides, the ethical questions. They're giving quite a glamorized impression of the armed forces, and that's a big concern. I'll just finish by saying one major claim, or two major claims that the Armed Forces and Ministry of Defence also make about these visits are that A, other employers go in just the same, so it's not that the Armed Forces are getting a special privilege, and B, that they only go in when invited by teachers. So with the first one, actually, we looked at emergency services visits to schools in Scotland. The ambulance service said, we don't have capacity to go in schools. The police said they have 60 officers attached to schools, but that would usually be sort of doing things like policing, the school campus and so on, so not a careers-focused thing. And the fire service do have comparable number of visits going on. However, the majority of those are focused on fire safety rather than careers. Then we also have to ask, are these employers anyway comparable to the armed forces? And essentially, I think the answer has to be no, when it is a unique job. with unique risks and unique ethical questions, which just don't seem to be being explored properly. Just to finish, ForcesWatch are looking to work more and more in Scotland. What happened in Wales recently was that there was a petition submitted to the Welsh Assembly Petitions Committee on this issue, which meant that they then had to look into it. Evidence was submitted, pupils gave testimonies and so on. And we're looking to initiate something similar through the Scottish Parliament, partly in liaison with Quakers in Scotland. And we're hoping that various organisations and individuals will support promoting that petition. And there is research that's ongoing. Update that data from 2012 to the present time, get more information from local councils, because the Scottish Government has said it's not our responsibility. We delegate this decision on whether or not to allow the armed forces to go into schools, whether or not to give advice to schools, to local councils. Interestingly, the data we got so far from councils suggests that they're a bit unclear what's happening themselves. They're saying things like they aren't getting privileged access when clearly they are, or that we're not aware of any imbalanced point of view being put across when, from our evidence, there really is. So that's something to watch. And again, I really encourage you to take stuff at the end. There's lots of information. I know I've thrown quite a lot of statistics and quotes at you, but I think one of the best ways that this can be questioned and challenged, if people feel moved to do so, is by informing ourselves very clearly of what's going on and then taking that to the schools, preferably through teachers, students, and family members of teachers and students, and really questioning, is this appropriate? Should this be happening in our schools? Thank you.